We're learning Lekutei Sichos, Chelek Yud Ches, Parshas Pinchas, the second Sicha, page 334. This is a Sicha explaining the very last Rashi in this week's Parsha. The Parsha this week, it's where it has all of the halachas of the Karbanis brought on the Yomim Tovim. And then there's the last pasuk in the Parsha, which Rashi explains, and the Rabbi will speak about this at length. Beim Siyum von den Sedre, Nachdem wie die Parsha rechnet is the Karbanis. The end of this week's Parsha, after the Torah elaborates on all the Karbanis that are brought on Yomim Tovim. And starting actually with Tamid, the Karban Tamid brought every day, the Musafim from Shabbos, Rish Chodesh, then going from Shabbos to Rish Chodesh, and from Yedin Moed, including every Yontif. Shteit, so the pasuk that concludes everything is, Vayeme Moshe b'nei Yisrael, Kachal asher tziva Hashem es Moshe. And Moshe Rabbeinu said to Yidden, like everything that Hashem had commanded him. Favos darf the pasuk sagen, as Moshe hat es alles übergegeben zu den Bnei Yisrael. So the obvious question here is, why does it have to say that Moshe Rabbeinu related everything to the Yidden? Zudem ist nötig zu lassen wissen, als Moshe hat Mekayim gewinnt, der Eibishens ansagt zu him, Tzavis Bnei Yisrael, Marta Aleim es Karbani v'Goyme. Is it necessary to tell me that Moshe fulfilled Hashem's command, that he should give over all these mitzvahs to the Yidden, all the details of the Karbanis? Und wie mir gefintach bekamen Mekaymes, we find in many places, as es steht nur der Zivi Hashem al Moshe, it only says the mitzvah that Hashem gave to Moshe, und nicht wie Moshe hat es danach übergegeben zu Yidden. And it does not say in the Torah that Moshe Rabbeinu repeated it to the Yidden, and it's self-understood that he did. Und der Tam ist Poshet, es ist verstandig von sich allein, as wie bald der Eibishter hat es gesagt zu Moshe. Since the Eibishter said this to Moshe Rabbeinu, Kedei, as all this übergeben zu Yidden, with the purpose that he should relate it to Yidden, hat Moshe sicher as getan, so Moshe Rabbeinu certainly did so. Und es ist auf sehr viel Poshet, this is so obvious, as me gefind nicht, as Rashi soll das bewahren in sein Pirish. Never does Rashi have to even explain this, why the Torah doesn't say that Moshe Rabbeinu gave it over to Yidden. He obviously did. So hein, favos, darf es da, der Bosik, yeah, the Tzela. So the question is, why is there an exception over here? Why does the Torah here tell us that Moshe Rabbeinu said over all these mitzvahs of the Karbanis to the Yidden? Is Rashi of them mefarish? So this is the question that Rashi comes to address, and Rashi explains. Lahafsik inyan. This pasuk is written here to separate this previous parsha from the following parsha. Divrei Rabbi Shmuel, this is what Rabbi Shmuel says in the Sifri. Now Rashi explains the pshat and what Rabbi Shmuel is saying. Lefisha kan dvarav shel mokim. Up until here, in the parsha of all these karbanis, it's the words of Hashem to Moshe. Parshas Nedarim, the beginning of next week's parsha, Mascheles b'dibur shel Moshe. It begins with Moshe Rabbeinu speaking. Vaydaber Moshe al Rashi Amates. So Hutzrach lahafsik tchila. So therefore the Torah needs to first make a separation. V'loymar, and to say shechaza Moshe v'omar parsha zuli Yisrael. That Moshe Rabbeinu also repeated what the Eibishter told him in the parsha of the Karbanis to the Yidden. Shimloi kain, if it's not going to clearly say that Moshe gave it over to Yidden, Yesh b'mashma, from reading the psukim, it would seem Shalayam zu ala b'parshas nedarim his childvarav, that it did not repeat the karbanis to the Yidden, and Moshe only begins speaking with the halachis of the nedarim, as it begins Vaydaber Moshe al Rashi Amatis, that begins the parsha of nedarim. So it would seem from the flow of the psukim that parshas karbanis, the Eibishter told Moshe, and Moshe did not relate it to Klal Yisrael, and he starts speaking to Klal Yisrael only about the halachas of nedarim. So therefore the Torah makes a hefsek and separates and says what was said before to Moshe, he gave over to the Yidden, and then besides that, Vaydaber Moshe al Rashi Amatis, that he said to them the halachas of the nedarim. However, this Rashi needs a further clarification. Yes, it's true. If it would not say this, that Moshe spoke to the Yidden and said the halachas of the karbanis to them, then the flow of the psukim would seem since only following this does it say that Moshe Rabbeinu speaks to the Yidden, as the friedige parsha hat Moshe nicht gesagt zu Yidden. That the previous parsha, Moshe Rabbeinu did not relate to the Yidden. That's what it seems in the context of the flow of the words of the psukim. However, the question still remains, how could there even be a thought to say, as Moshe at nit mekayim given the Eibishter Zongdog, Tzav as Bnei Yisrael v'amarta aleim, that Moshe didn't fulfill the command of the Eibishter to give it over to the Yidden? Certainly he did. So even if in the flow of the Psukim it would seem this way, but it would be obvious that he did give it over to the Yidden. So it's not necessary for the Torah to clarify that. So the question really still remains, what's the basis to say that Moshe Rabbeinu would not give it over to the Yidden? And therefore, when I see such a mashmas in the Psukim, I would say that that's actually the fact. And the Torah has to say no, that he did give it over to the Yidden. The Ramban is mefarish dem Pshat in Rabbi Shmuel's Werte. The Ramban, he quotes Rabbi Shmuel's opinion in the Sifri, and he explains lahafsek inyan. When Rabbi Shmuel says that it says vayayim Moshe b'nei Yisrael, so it's coming to separate this inyan here. So the Ramban explains it as follows: Oibs volt nit gestanden der Pasuk vayayim Moshe, volt men nit gewusst zu welcher Pasha es bezieht sich der Pasuk vayedaber Moshe al Rashi Amatis. If it would not say vayayim Moshe, and then it says vayedaber Moshe al Rashi Amatis, that Moshe Rabbeinu spoke to the leaders of the Shvatim, I wouldn't know regarding that pasuk of vayedaber Moshe, what is it going on? Tzi la'achrav, so the dinner from Parshas Matos, is it referring to the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu spoke to them all the halachas of the Nedarim in the following parsha? Or maybe you have to read that vayedaber Moshe al Rashi Amatis, telling you that he repeated to them all the halachas of the karbanos of the previous parsha, to the dinner from Unza parsha. So that's the issue. There's sort of a suffix how to interpret this pasuk. The Rebbe steht beim Sim von unser Parsha, vayem Moshe b'nei Yisrael. So it says here that Moshe Rabbeinu repeated to the Yidden these halachas, kedei lahafsek inyan, to separate that subject. Wir soll wissen, as mit vayedaber Moshe Rashi Amatis, hebt sich an anay inyan, wie Parshas Nedarim. So that's how we know that when it afterwards says vayedaber Moshe, that it's not going on what's said before, but it's going on later, that Moshe Rabbeinu is telling them the Parsha of Nedarim. That's why it has to say it over here. Otherwise, there will be no clarity over here where this pasuk belongs. Vasazoi is the pshat in lahafsek inyan b'mekaymis rabim b'sifra u b'sifri v'the Ramban sagt. And as the Ramban says, this expression lahafsek inyan, to make a separation in the subject, is an expression used in the Sifra and the Sifri in many places, and that's always what it means. When there's a pasuk where it's unclear how to put the pasuk before or for after, so the Torah writes another pasuk to clarify that Vayemer, and like in our case, Vayemer Moshe b'nei Yisrael goes on what's written before, and Vayedaber goes on what's written after. And the Rabbi brings another example that you have in next week's parsha. Und wie is Neusef Nochmer, as Rashi Alein, Rashi himself says this exact pshat from pasuk, Vaytem Parshas Matos. So there it says Va'ato Hirgu. So it says Hirgu, that they should kill Kol Zachar, and then it says V'chol Isha, and all women as well, Haroigu. So why does it have to say again Haroigu? Why doesn't it say once Hirgu for Zachar and the Isha? As it zweite Haroigu steht lahafsek inyan. It has to say the second time Haroigu to put a separation in the pasuk. Und der Teitsteis, Rashi explains, as oib noch v'chol isha volt gestanden noch amal Haroigu. If it would not say again after v'chol isha that they too have to be killed, volt man nit gewusst, zi v'chol isha gehört zum friedigen Sog von Hirgu kol Zachar. I wouldn't know. Maybe v'chol isha does belong together with what the pasuk says by the Kol Zachar, that just like the male should be killed, this is in the Milchama of Midyan, so too the women should be killed as well. Oder zum zweiten Dingen, maybe it goes on the following pasuk, when it says afterward that the children should be left to live, maybe v'chol isha goes along with the children to be left to live. Therefore the Torah has to write again Haroigu by women to make it clear, to separate the women from the taf that follow afterwards. That's the pshat that Rashi himself says later, benegay to that pasuk, where it says the term lahafsek inyan, and that's what it means. So now, does Rashi agree to the Ramban's pshat in our pasuk here? That when it says lahafsek inyan regarding Vayomer Moshe b'nei Yisrael, that it's in order to make clear that Moshe Rabbeinu repeated these halachas, and also Vayedaber Moshe Rashi Amatis goes on the following parsha, but we can't say that. In Pirish Rashi do, however, Rashi here, we can't learn it. This is how Rashi understands here the meaning of lahafsek inyan. Val Rashi is mishane from Lashon Nasifri. Rashi here changes from the language that the Sifri says. Eini yadeya bameh inyan medaber. The Sifri says it's unclear what is this talking about, what this is going on. Rashi doesn't say that. The issue here is not that it's unclear what the pasuk refers to. Und schreibt befeirish, and Rashi clearly spells out. As wenn nit der pasuk vayome Moshe, if not for the fact that it says it that Moshe repeated the halachas of the korbanos to the Yidden, wollte man hat toes gehad, what would be the mistake? Nicht, dass die spätige Pasuk, weil da bei Moshe Rashi Amates bezieht sich zu früher wie Leuten Pirish Ramban. The mistake is not regarding the first pasuk in next week's parsha, that it would have thought that that pasuk belongs to the conclusion of this week's parsha. That's not the mistake. Nor, rather, the mistake is, as loy omar lehem zu, I would have thought that everything over here in Parshas HaKarbonis was never related to the Yidden by Moshe Rabbeinu. Ela beParshas Nedarim hischol devarav. He only began speaking to the Yidden the halachas of Nedarim. That's the mistake that I would have made. So therefore our question remains that the Rebbe asked before, even if in the flow of the Psukim it would seem this way, but logically it can't be. So therefore, without the Torah saying it, I would know that Moshe repeated it to the Yidden. So where is there even room for such a mistake that he wouldn't give over to the Yidden the halachas that he's supposed to give them over? Ich darf me verstehen. Now there's another question here. There's another pasuk similar that we find in Parshas Emor. Wie der Ramban fragt, and the Ramban asks the question, Euch in Parshas Emor, beim Seif from Parshas Hamayadais, there's also a parsha of all the halachas of the Yomim Tovim. Zog the pasuk, Vayedaber Moshe es Me'adei Hashem al Bnei Yisrael. Moshe Rabbeinu says over all the halachas of the Yomim Tovim to the Yidden. And if it's over there as well, you have the same question. Why does the Torah have to say that Moshe Rabbeinu repeated what the Eibishter told him to the Yidden? There's many different explanations in the Medrash why it's necessary to say this. Rashi aber stellt sich nicht up with them. Rashi doesn't say a word to explain there what this pasuk is saying. Is it move on? So the question here is, Oy bim shute shom mikra, fadet sich bior, favos der pasuk that zählt, as Moshe hat übergegeben dem Zivi Hashem wegen Meidem zu Yidden. If im shute shom mikra, it requires an explanation when the Torah tells us that Moshe Rabbeinu said over the halachas to the Yidden. So it has to be explained. Why does the pasuk tell it to us? Hat es Rashi gedacht masbe sein dort, wo mir gefindt es im pasuk zum ersten Mal? So Rashi should have addressed this question the first time this comes up, früher, in Parshas Emor, und nicht warten bis unser pasuk. And it's not necessary for him to wait until you come over here in this week's parsha, in Parshas Pinchas, where it says Vayeme Moshe, and Rashi addresses why the Torah has to say Vayeme Moshe. Nochmer, the question goes even further. The asbar of Rashi zogda, the answer that Rashi gives here to that question, which is Val Nor Atkan Dvarav Shal Mokim V'chulu, because since only until here Moshe is hearing the words of the Eibishter said to him, and then beginning next week's parsha, it's Moshe Rabbeinu speaking, so you can make a mistake that Moshe Rabbeinu did not repeat what the Eibishter told him. Kemer Etzagan in Parshas Emor. That's not an answer that fits there in Parshas Emor. Val Dorten Hoipzuchon the Parsha Shalachrize mit Dvarav Shal Mokim. The beginning of the following parsha after Emor is also the Eibishter speaking. So there's no room to make that mistake over there that Moshe Rabbeinu did not repeat the halachas of the Yomim Tovim to the Yidden. So why does Rashi not address the very same question that he does address here earlier when it comes up the first time in Parshas Emor? Der Tam favos od di kasha. So now, to answer this question that we just asked, zu livos darf stehen, as Moshe hat übergegeben dem Zivi zu Bnei Yisrael, wer darf da und nicht in Parshas Emor. This is a question that Rashi addresses only here in this week's parsha, but in Parshas Emor, it's clear, it's self-understood, and Rashi doesn't even address it. So you can give the following simple answer. Parshas Hamaydos from Parshas Emor is gesagt geworden besmiches zu Hakomas HaMishkan. Over there, that parsha in Emor, when was it said to the Yidden? It was said at about the time when the Mishkan was put up. Noch fahren minye b'nei Yisrael. It was actually said to them even before the Yidden were counted in the beginning of Parshas Midbar, Bamidbar. Be'echad lachodesh hasheni. They were counted in the first day of Chodesh Iyar. Wegen welches erzählt in Chumash Bamidbar. Und zwischen die Mitzvahs und Dinim dorten, amongst the Mitzvahs of the Parshas Hamaydos and Parshas Emor, zenen da zelche, wo Kiyum is Shayach, Dafke, and Eretz Yisrael. There are such mitzvahs that it's only possible to fulfill them in Eretz Yisrael. L'dugme, for example, Omer, the mitzvah of the Karban Omer, Chodosh, the Isser of Chodosh, before you bring the Karban Omer, and Shtei Alechem, the mitzvah of bringing the Shtei Alechem on Shavuos. So those are some of the things that are amongst the Parshas HaMoedes, and that only applies in Eretz Yisrael. So over there, one would think, Emes Take as Moshe od Ziche ibegegeben alle Tzivui Hashem zu Yidden. Yes, true. Definitely Moshe Rabbeinu always repeated all of the halachas that the Eibishter told him to the Yidden. Und noch mehr, and even more so, Bechlal hat das getan gleich nach den Herren dem Zivi von Eibishter. In general, Moshe Rabbeinu repeated it to the Yidden immediately after he heard it. Wie verstandig von Pirish Rashi bei Matan Torah. This is understood from what Rashi says by Matan Torah. Shaloi hoya Moshe peine la'asakov ela min ahar ela am. When Moshe Rabbeinu came down from the mountain to speak to the Eibishter, he did not go to his own personal things. He went immediately from the mountain to the Yidden, to tell the Yidden the halachas. So that's usually the case. Aber in dem Fall, but over here in this case, where the Eibishter is telling Moshe Rabbeinu, hat nicht alle Protedinim übergegeben gleich. Here it's possible to say that he did not repeat to the Yidden immediately everything that he heard. Why not? Since amongst these halachas are things that are not relevant immediately for that time. It's things that are negeya when the Yidden are going to come into Eretz Yisrael. Be'ez as Moshe is given van Numen, and Moshe Rabbeinu was very busy with Emferin Adover HaKoshe was Yivin al Moshe, with all kinds of difficult matters that was brought to Moshe's attention to be answered immediately. Mit Vaidaitale Mesaderech Asher Yelchuba V'Samaisa Asher Yasen, Moshe Rabbeinu is there to teach them and to answer them the questions that they have right there and then in Tog Teglich and Levin. What's relevant on their daily life right then and there. So therefore, in this case, because the Parshas HaMoedes includes halachas that are only going to be relevant later when they come into Eretz Yisrael, there's room to say that he did not repeat this immediately. Especially according to the opinion that's brought in the Braise, was Mashmousa, where it seems, as Parshas HaMoedes dort is gesagt geworden noch Parshas de Golem, that the Parsha of the Yomim Tovim was said together and after the Parsha where it says about all the Golem, with the way the Yidden are going to be camping and so on. Seine gewen viele andere Parshas, wo seinen demult gewen a Gele Meise. So if so, amongst the Parshas HaMoedes, the Eibishter also told him many other halachas that are very relevant immediately for the Yidden to know. L'dugme minye b'nei Yisrael. That's the same time when the Eibishter said about the fact that we're going to be counting the Yidden, the Golem, the way they're going to be camping, and the different flags, Masois, how they're going to be traveling, Pesach Sheni, the halach of Pesach Sheni, the Chulu. So therefore, there's reason to say that the Eibishter, that Moshe, that is, delayed relating to the Yidden the halachas that the Eibishter told him. As far as the pasuk dort Meisif himself, that no, Moshe Rabbeinu did repeat to the Yidden immediately these halachas of Parshas Emer. As had bald übergeben alle Protedinim von der Parsha zu Yidden, that he did immediately say it to them. Und das Gufe lernt uns der Zivoi zu Moshe. This is also the command that Eibishter says, speak to the Yidden, tell them these halachas of the Yomim Tovim. Hat gemeint, as soll bald übergeben die alle Dinim. The Eibishter is telling them not to wait, although many of these things are only going to be relevant when they enter into Eretz Yisrael. You should immediately tell the Yidden these halachas. So that's understood over there. That's why in Parshas Emor this is obvious. Rashi does not address why it says Vayedaber Moshe el bnei Yisrael. Ma'ashenkin in unser Parsha, which all of this is not the case when it comes to our Parsha, which is nidok kein tam auf abzulegen. There's no reason to delay giving over the Yidden the halachas of these mitzvahs of karbanis. Is doch muva mi'ei love, if so itself understood kanal, as we had said, as noch in Tzivi von der Eibishter Tzaves b'nei Yisrael v'amarta aleim geimer, after the Eibishter commands that he should give it over to Yidden, hat Moshe gleich übergegeben die alle Dinim. So Moshe Rabbeinu definitely repeated all of this. Befrat as retzach wegen Sefer Boim Shana. This, the parashas of Karbonis here, this week's parasha, Parshas Pinchas, is being said to Moshe Rabbeinu at the end of the 40 years. So if he's not going to give it over to the Yidden now, so when yes? This is coming towards the end of Moshe Rabbeinu being with the Yidden here. So it's here where the question comes up. Was erzähltens the pasuk vayem Moshe b'nei Yisrael? Why does the pasuk have to say that Moshe Rabbeinu spoke and said these halachas to the Yidden? My kamash malon. It's obvious. What's the chiddush that he said it to the Yidden? There's no reason to delay it. Rashi, so therefore Rashi here gives the answer lahafsika inyan, like it says, Rabbi Shmuel says in Sifri, and Rashi explains she'im loiken yesh b'mashma sh'le'omelem zu ela b'pashas nedarim hischol dvarav. Otherwise, we would think that it would seem that he did not say over these halachas to the Yidden, and he only began speaking to them to the halachas of nedarim. Could come on Siv Zayin, as will be explained in Siv Zayin, why that is the case, that Moshe Rabbeinu would not be repeating these halachas to the Yidden. Okay, so we'll see. The Rebbe will explain it soon in the Sikha here. But meanwhile, in Sifei, the Rebbe will explain another detail based on the name that Rashi quotes here. Move on, Favos Rashi is maitik dem nomen from Bala Maimer. We can now understand why Rashi, when he brings this pshat of the Sifri, he brings it quoting the name of who said so, which is Rabbi Shmuel. As the Rebbe always says, Rashi usually does not quote the names of the Tanoim or Amiroim that said what he's saying. When he does, there's a reason. So if you hear, what's the reason? Der Bir Anal, the explanation that we've explained there. Favos as darf stehen in Parshas Emor vayedaber Moshe b'nei Yisrael. That in Parshas Emor it's clear why the Torah is saying that Moshe Rabbeinu repeated the halachas to the Yidden. Verleibt nicht, what man gemeint as that is abgelegt of später, because there's room to say otherwise that he did delay it for later, since those halachas are not relevant for right now. Was loy dem bier darf man suchen nach Teretz auf dem Pasuk in unser Sedra, and it's according to that explanation there that the question comes up here in Parshas Pinchas, because over here in this week's Parsha there is no reason to delay it, because all the halachas are relevant for right now. Is masim nor ledas Rabbi Shmuel. All this entire approach is only according to the opinion of Rabbi Shmuel. What's Rabbi Shmuel's opinion? So now here there's a machlokes between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva regarding the Eibishter Bechlal telling over the Moshe Rabbeinu and to the Yidden the mitzvahs. So Rabbi Shmuel says, as Klolus Nemru B'Sinai. The general outline of the mitzvahs was said by Har Sinai. Upratus by El Moed. And then the details of all the mitzvahs was spoken to Moshe Rabbeinu in the Mishkan by the El Moed. So we see that the Eibishter does not say all the details right in the beginning, he leaves the details for later. So if that's the way the Eibishter teaches the mitzvahs, first the klolus, and then the details he leaves for later, so there's definitely room to say, kanal, as we've explained before, as Moshe hat abgewart mit ibegeben, die prati hat dinim von die Meiden. That so too Moshe Rabbeinu waited to give over the details of these halachas of Parshas Emor, the Parshas Amoedes, to the Yidden. Because as the Rebbe said before, he had other things that were relevant on a day-to-day basis. So Parshas Emor is speaking about halachas that are negeya from when Yidden come to Eretz Yisrael. So we can say that Moshe Rabbeinu delayed those details for then. That's according to Rabbi Shmuel. Aber loit sein bar plukta. According to the one that argues with Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Akiva. Was halt as klolus upratis nemru b'Sinai, that by Sinai the Eibishter told Moshe Rabbeinu all the mitzvahs with all the details right away, did not delay it. And then v'nishnu b'El Moed, they were all repeated by the El Moed, v'nishtal shulu b'Arvis Moev, and then by Arvis Moev it was said to the Yidden yet a third time, all the details. Kumtois, as mod gesagt, alle pratia mitzvahs, a filimus is nit given a gay elemaisa. The Eibishter says immediately by Har Sinai, all the halachas, with all the details, even though it's not all relevant for right then. So heint, verwas soll man sagen, as dort abgewahrt mit ibegeben die dinim später. So then why would you say that over here, by Parshas Emor, because there are certain details that are not relevant, so he delayed it for later? But no, Rabbi Akiva disagrees with that line of thinking. Rabbi Akiva holds, you see by the Eibishter, he speaks all the details right in the beginning, even though it's not relevant now. So by Moshe Rabbeinu as well, it would be self-understood that he gave over to the Yidden all the halachas immediately. So why does the Torah have to come and let me know by Yedaber Moshe that Moshe Rabbeinu said over all these halachas? So according to Rabbi Akiva, the hezbollah we said before doesn't work. So according to Rabbi Akiva, what would we say? So what is the explanation why in Parshas Emor and over here in Parshas Pinchas as well it says Vayedaber Moshe Me'ed Hashem or Vayeme Moshe b'nei Yisrael? Why does it have to say that Moshe Rabbeinu gave it over to Yidden? As loy to Rabbi Akiva. So we're going to have to say according to Rabbi Akiva, as es is mei korek in kashenit. That this is not a question. Weil halt, Rabbi Akiva's opinion is, as azoi is the derech hakosef. This is the style of the Torah. As amal shtei, the dib Hashem al Moshe. Sometimes it just mentions what the Eibusha spoke to Moshe. Amal, the dib Moshe l'bnei Yisrael. Sometimes it only says what Moshe Rabbeinu said to the Yidden, and it doesn't say that the Eibusha said this to Moshe. When amal beida, sometimes it says in the Torah both, that the Eibusha spoke to Moshe, and that Moshe related it to the Yidden. So that's just the style of the Torah. We don't have a specific reason why, but sometimes it says one or the other, and sometimes it does say both. Is b'meilo ich nit kasha if the pasuk in unser parsha, and if so, there's no question in this week's parsha as well why the Torah says Vayayim Moshe el bnei Yisrael. So therefore, it says the name Rabbi Shmuel here because the whole question comes up only according to Rabbi Shmuel. According to Rabbi Shmuel, there's a clear difference between Parshas Emor and Parshas Pinchas. In Parshas Emor, there are details that are not relevant for then, so there's room to say that Moshe delayed it. So the Torah has to say Vayadaber Moshe. In this week's parsha, there's no reason to delay it, so over here the question comes up. But according to Rabbi Akiva, there's no difference. We see that the Eibishter says all the pratim even when it's not relevant. So what's the difference between Parshas Emor and this week's parsha? Elamai, it must be that this is just a derech of the Torah. Sometimes it says Moshe repeated it and sometimes not. So now based on this, if this is the way we're going to say according to Rabbi Akiva, that this is the style of the Torah, so now we can't ask, so why can't we then just give this answer? As der Pasuk state, that the Pasuk here in this week's Parsha says, not because we're trying to negate a mistake in the understanding of the Pasuk, but because this is just the style of the Torah that sometimes it says that Moshe Rabbeinu gave it over to the Yidden. Oich, loit, Rabbi Shmuel. Wouldn't that be an adequate answer even according to Rabbi Shmuel? So why are we looking for a new and different answer according to Rabbi Shmuel if it's possible to say that this is the style of the Torah? So the Rebbe explains, no. As in dem gufe is totally the plukta now for Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel. This very point itself, whether we could actually go ahead and say that this is the style of the Torah, there's no one style. Sometimes it says Moshe spoke to the Yidden, sometimes it says the Eibusha spoke to Moshe, and sometimes it says both. This approach is actually something that only Rabbi Akiva holds up. We can't say this according to Rabbi Shmuel. Why? So going back now to their original machlokes here. Leit Rabbi Akiva as klalus aprates nemru b'Sinai. All details were said in Har Sinai. And then v'nishnu b'El Moed. They were repeated a second time in El Moed. Then v'nishtalshlu b'Arvis Moed. Then a third time in Moed. Darf man sagen. So according to Rabbi Akiva, you must say, as agam, as alle mitzvahs, b'chlalus or b'protes, zene gesagt geworden 3 Mal. So all of these mitzvahs, with all the details, were said 3 times. B'Sinai b'El Moed b'Arvis Moed. Is aber die Teire nit mefaret und mefarish in 3 Erte die alle mitzvahs zu protein. The Teire, in all those 3 times, does not spell out all the details again and again. Und bloß a Chelek von sei in 2 Erte. There's only some of the details that are mentioned in 2 of the places, some by Sinai, some by El Moed, or some by Arvis Mayav, but it doesn't say all the details again and again. So in other words, the style of the way it's written in the Teire is not precise to the way it actually happened. Because the way it actually happened was, all of the details were said over 3 times. So therefore, similar we could say over here regarding the Torah writing, whether the Eibusha spoke to Moshe, whether Moshe spoke to the Yidden, or sometimes it says both. Amal is the Torah mefaret euch dem dibber von Moshe l'bnei Yisrael, und amal nit. Sometimes the Torah says that yes, Moshe gave it over to the Yidden, and sometimes it does not elaborate, and sometimes it does not mention it. So just like we see regarding this whole union of all the details of the mitzvahs, that it's not precise and the Torah does not say all the details again and again, we can say the same thing regarding Moshe speaking to the Yidden, that it's also, there's no one style, sometimes yeah and sometimes not. The Tam from Rabbi Shmuel, not Rabbi Shmuel that argues. What's the basis of his reasoning? As klalus nemru b'Sinai. That Rabbi Shmuel says the mitzvahs in general were all said by Sinai, and then upratis by El Moed. The details were then given over by El Moed. So the basis of his opinion is as follows. His opinion is as bechlal darf man annehmen as jede prat wie inje wie wird geschrieben in Teire is wie das is gewen bepeil. All the details written in the Teire This is the way it actually happened. There's no reason to say that the Torah is writing some of the details of what happened. No. Rabbi Shmuel says that we see that in Parshas, by Sinai, the Torah was given over to the Yidden B'chlalos, and then the details were said in Ayal Mayit. So therefore, we have to read the Psukim in the Torah literally. Seiden, unless we have something that's forcing us to say otherwise. Und der Rebbe, so therefore he says, Halter, as die Pratia Mitzvahs sind gesagt geworden, dort wo steht, as befeirischen Torah. The details of the mitzvahs were said only there where the Torah says so clearly. Und nicht dreimal. And all the details were not said 3 times, B'Sinai, B'El Mayid, Ubar, V'Smayiv, in all 3 places. So therefore, according to Rabbi Shmuel, the same applies here. Same thing here regarding whether the Torah tells us that Moshe spoke to the Yidden. Vibalt, as the Torah is mefarish and mefaret, daf gedo, vayidabe Moshe b'nei Yisrael. It's only here that the Torah says that Moshe spoke to the Yidden. Darf man sagen, so we must say, das ist der Fall, was ist da a Chiddush in dem, welch is shaykh zu der Parsha. That there's a reason why the Torah is writing it here. It is precise. The Torah is telling us for a certain reason, dafke here, why Moshe Rabbeinu gave it over to the Yidden. That's the basis of Rabbi Shmuel's opinion. That if we don't have anything forcing us to say otherwise, everything in the Torah is written precisely the way it happened. And therefore, this is the basis of the question, why does the Torah have to say that Moshe Rabbeinu spoke to the Yidden? Isn't it obvious that he fulfilled the command of the Eibishter to give it over to the Yidden? So now the Rebbe will explain the Pshat and Rashi's answer, that we would have made a mistake to think that Moshe Rabbeinu did not give it over to the Yidden. What's the basis really of that mistake? And the Rebbe gives an introduction and comes back to answer this towards the end of Siv Zayin. Der Tam was klolis in Yonei Amedes is zerteilt in 2 Parshias. Now the reason why, in general, all the halachas of the Yomim Tovim is divided into 2 different Parshas. Aleph in Parshas Emor, wo the Ikra ad Goshe is of Issa Malacha. In Parshas Emor, there the Torah primarily focuses on the Yomim Tovim and the fact that it's Oster b'Malacha. Und auf die Mitzvahs von jeden Yontif, and also the specific mitzvahs that apply to every Yontif. Es wird dort aber euch gerät und bechlalos wegen der Karbonis von jeden Yontif. And then it also mentions in general terms about the Karbonis that are brought, but it primarily focuses on the Issa Malacha and the mitzvahs of the Yontif. That's in Parshas Emor. Beis, in unser Parsha, over here in our Parsha, wo dat Goshe Ikris is, auf die Prote a Karbonis, was me bringt jeden Tag. Here the Torah gets into all the details of the Karbonis that are brought every day, and then Shabbos, Rosh Chodesh, und Yontif. Aber se wird da euch der Mond wegen Issa Malacha von Yontif. It also mentions in passing about the fact that Yontif is a time which is also b'Malacha. So why is it divided this way? Käme me weiß ein auf 2 Efanim. So this could be explained in 1 or 2 ways. Aleph. One way to explain this is as follows. Sie sind gesagt geworden zu Moshe als besondere 2 Parshias in besondere Zeiten. Moshe Rabbeinu, or it's given over, that is, in the Torah this way because it actually was said by the Eibishter to Moshe Rabbeinu in 2 different time periods. Parshas Emor, b'smichas ha'akamas ha'mishkan. Parshas Emor was said then when the Mishkan was put up. Parshas Einu zum Soif von der Arbaim Shana. And all the Karbanis over here, now this week's Parsha, was said many years later, at the end, towards the end of the 40 years. It was divided in 2 different times. Und das, was man hat die Parshas, a Karbanis von Parshas Einu, nicht gesagt, bald nach Hakamas HaMishkan. Now, if you'll ask the question, why is it so? Why didn't Eibishter tell the Yidden immediately then, when he's telling them all the halachas of the Yomim Tovim, also all the details of the Karbanis? Don't they have to know those halachas of the Karbanis every day, Chodesh, Shabbos, Yontif? Simply we have to say that all these Karbanis, according to Rashi, were brought in the Midbar. Achutz dem, achutz di, was is mefurish kisavoy olaretz. The only ones that were not brought in the Midbar is the ones that the Torah clearly says that it's only when you come into Eretz Yisrael, kisavoy olaretz. So why didn't Eibush say the Parsha, our Parsha here of Karbanis, immediately then together with Parsha Emor? So we could answer as follows. The Reiftu von unser Parsha is the concept over here, the Chiddush that it says in this week's Parsha is as follows. Tzaves b'nei Yisrael v'amarta aleim. Give over all these halachas of the Karbanis to all the Yidden. Der Zirus unsagt zu alle Yidden, as the Karbanis Zibur sollen gebracht werden bis Manam. Yet you speak to all the Yidden that they should see to it that all the Karbanis have to be brought in the right time. Aber, so that's the Chiddush here, that all the Yidden are hearing about this. Aber, die Pratia Karbanis Gufe, the details of all these Karbanis sind schon angesagt geworden zu Moshe von früher. That was already said to Moshe earlier. Und hat sie übergegeben zu die Yechidim, was haben sich vernommen mit der Kravas HaKarbanis, Aaron Avana Vakainim. And at that time, he did give it over to the individuals, to Aaron and his children, that needed to know these halachis of the Karbanis. The Chiddush here in Parshas Pinchas, in this week's Parsha, is the fact that now the Eibush is telling him, give it over to all the Yidden as well. So this is one way how to understand the division of the halachis of Parshas Emor and Parshas Pinchas. It was actually said to the Yidden in the way it's recorded in the Torah in two completely time periods. Beis, but then there's another approach. Beide Parshas and gesagt geworden zu Moshe zusammen. Both of these Parshas, the halachas of the Yamim Tovim in Emor and the halachas of the Karbanis in this week's Parsha, they were said at the same time. Not only that, va'adarabah, Parshas HaKarbanis, the Parshas Seinu, is gesagt geworden Keidim le Parshas HaMeides von Emor. That was actually said to Moshe Rabbeinu even before all the details of the halachas of the Yamim Tovim. Was the far steht in Parshas HaMeides, and therefore by the Parshas HaMeides in Emor, when it speaks about the Karbanis, it says Ve'yikrafte Misha, you will bring the Karbanis stam, and it just says bring the Karbanis, nit oisteichendig was for a carbon bedarf bringen, and it does not spell out what are those Karbanis you have to bring. Weil die Pratia Karbanis hat man schon gesagt zu Moshe von früher. Because Moshe Rabbeinu heard already from before what those Karbanis are, and he already gave it over to the ones that had to hear, to Aaron and his children, and therefore it just says in the Parsha in short, them that you will bring those Karbanis that was already said earlier to Moshe Rabbeinu. So the point is that both Parshas Medes of Emor and the Karbanis of this week's Parsha were set together at the same time. Narafal Pikain, but yet, Tzili Batam, for some reason, Hati Teire, reingestellt, die Parsha from Karbanis, da in unser Parsha. The Torah places the Parsha of Karbanis much later in this week's Parsha, B'Sefer Ba'im Shana at the end of 40 years. Wie der Klal, was Rashi bringt herab, bekame Mekaimes B'Pirushay, the rule that Rashi says in many places, Ein Muktim U'Me'oche B'Teira. The Torah is not necessarily written in a chronological order, and it could be out of order. So therefore, the Parshas HaMeides comes before, and Parshas Karbanis is written much later, even though Parshas Karbanis was really said before. According to this approach, as beide Parshas, the Emor or the Parshas Seinu, all these halachas of the Yamim Tovim, of Parshas Emor and of this week's Parsha, sind gesagt geworden zu Moshe bisman echad, were all said to Moshe at one time, V'ld gewen mistave, so then it would be logical to say, as der Onzog in Onne Parshas HaMeides and Emor, the command that it says in the beginning of Parshas Emor by the Parsha of the Yamim Tovim, Daber al b'nei Yisrael v'amarta lehem Moedei Hashem. Speak to the Yidden and tell them over the halachas of the Yamim Tovim. Why does it say that there? Why does it give this introduction that he should give it over to the Yidden? Meint zu austeilen die weitere Gepratim von alle Dinei Moed, was der Rebbe hat schon früher gesagt, Moshe, die Prate Dinim shebe Parshas Seinu. The Torah there is separating the dinim of the Yamim Tovim of Parshas Emor from all the other halachas of Yamim Tovim, which are the Karbanis and everything that it's written in this week's Parsha. As dafke zei, daf ibegeben zu alle Yidden. That it's only the details of Parshas Emor that Moshe Rabbeinu should tell all of Yidden. Und nicht die dinim verstehen in unser Parsha. But the halachas that it says in this week's Parsha does not have to be given over to all the Yidden, weil sie sind nicht negeya zu alle Yidden kanal. Because they are not relevant for all of Klal Yisrael. They're only relevant for Aaron and his children. That's what we would say. So Moshe Rabbeinu heard it all at the same time, but the Eibishter tells him, Daber al b'nei Yisrael, only those halachas of Parshas Emor, you should give over to all the Yidden, that's relevant for them. Und damit wollt man euch mevai gewen, and with this we could also explain, den ta mashinoi in Lashon HaKosov, there's another difference we find in the language of the Pasuk, Sufficient Parshas HaMeides, Parshas Emor, and Parshas HaKarbanis, the Parshas Seinu. When you look at the Parsha by Emor and this week's Parsha, so the difference is Dorten Hauptzuchan Yed Moed mit Anaye Dibur. Before every Yontif, it says again that Moshe Rabbeinu The Eibusher spoke to him. Vaydaber Hashem al Moshe leimer daber al bnei Yisrael. For every Yom Tov separately. Dagegen in unser Parsha. In contrast, here in this week's Parsha, steht nor beim Onei Parsha atzivi kloli tzavas bnei Yisrael v'amart aleim. It only says at one time, a general command in the beginning, that you should command the Yidden. It doesn't say it again by each one of the Yomim Tovim separately. So what's the difference? The Akdamet tzavas bnei Yisrael in unser Parsha, when it says in the beginning of this week's Parsha that you should command Yidden, is Akdamet klolis zu klolis Parshas Hamedes var karbonis von unser Parsha und von Parshas Emor. So that opening statement, tzavas bnei Yisrael, we can say is going both on all the halachas of the karbonis of this week's Parsha and also of Parshas Emor, which Moshe Rabbeinu heard them all at the same time. Danach is given that zweite Zivui, daber al bnei Yisrael v'amarta aleim. But then the Eibusher says again, regarding those halachas of Parshas Emor, that you should give it over to the Yidden, that onzog welche prote dinim darf übergeben alle Yidden. Which ones, what details of what I'm telling you now does have to be given over to all the Yidden specifically? Die verstehen in Parshas Emor canal, and that's what's written only in Parshas Emor. So yes, the Eibusher is telling Moshe Rabbeinu all the halachas of the karbonis in this week's Parsha and the halachas of Parshas Emor all at once, and saying to Moshe Rabbeinu, give it over to the Yidden. However, there's a difference. The halachas of Parshas Pinchas are only going to be given over to Aaron and his children, because they're the ones that are doing it. Mashenkein, the halachas of the Yomim Tovim. In this week's Parsha, the Torah says again, by every single, the Torah says again, daber al bnei Yisrael v'amarta aleim, because this has to be given over to all the Klal Yisrael. Und der Iber, kedei des madger sein noch mehr, so now in order to emphasize this even more, hat der Eibusher mefared gewähnt bei jeden Moed bazunde daber al bnei Yisrael. The Torah spells out by every Yom Tov separately again, speak to all the Yidden, because it's dafke this that's written here in Parshas Emor that's being given over to all the Yidden. Okay, so this is the introduction here. These are the two approaches of how we could explain the division of Parshas Emor and Parshas Pinchas. Either we'll take it literally, Parshas Emor was said after the Mishkan was built. Parshas Pinchas, this week's Parsha, was said at the end of the 40 years. That's why it's divided this way in the Torah. Or perhaps it was all said together, but Moshe Rabbeinu, in the Torah, it's recorded this way. Ein muktim u'mocha b'Torah, and Moshe Rabbeinu was commanded to give over then to all the Yidden the halachas of Parshas Emor, which is relevant to all Yidden, and in Parshas Pinchas, it wasn't given over to all the Yidden because it's not relevant to all the Yidden. So now the Rebbe will come back to explain the question we have, why would I think that the karbonis of Parshas Pinchas, Moshe Rabbeinu, did not repeat to the Yidden? So based on what we just said, we'll see the explanation here. V'balt as der klal, ein muktim u'mocha b'Torah. So now, this rule that the Torah is not written in a chronological order. Werd gesagt, ab pshutische mikra, dafke in fall, wenn man muss annehmen as die Parshas and a nitlit seder azmanim. That's only if we must, if you have a reason forcing us to say that what's written in the Parsha is not in order. Then we say, Ein muktim u'mocha b'Torah. Wie gerat schon vielmal, as it was said already many times. Ist verstandig, as al pi pshutisha mikra is Parshas HaKarbonis, the Parshaseinu, gesagt geworden lebesayif arbaim shana. So therefore, it's understood that looking at the simple pshat of the pasuk, Parshas HaKarbonis, that's here in this week's Parsha, let's leave it in the place where it is, that it's said in order, and it was said at the end of the 40 years. Und wie Rashi is medaikef in pasuk, and we could see this also from what Rashi says. Savas b'nei Yisrael v'amart aleim es karboni lachmi. Right over here at the beginning of all the parshas of Karbonis, what does Rashi say? Ma omar l'maylo. What is being said to Moshe Rabbeinu? What is it said right before this? So the diuk here is, Rashi says, Ma omar l'maylo. What does it say right before this? Nit lama nismecha parshas yifkad Hashem leparshas HaKarbonis. The language Moshe Rabbeinu uses is not, that Rashi uses, that is not, why are these two written at the same place in the Torah, one right after the other, but it was actually said at this time. The Pashtus, darf man annehmen, and as Parshas HaKarbonis is nit nur nismecha da, das heißt, dass die ist nur geschrieben geworden bis Michas her, aber gesagt geworden früher. So therefore, because we would simply say that if Parshas HaKarbonis is written here at the end of the 40 years, this is where it was actually said, Nor sie ist gesagt geworden. It was actually said over here. It's not just being written in the Torah here out of order, and it was said to Moshe Rabbeinu earlier. No, it was actually said right over here and now. That's the simple approach that I would say, following the rule that in Torah, everything is written in the order. Wenn sie wollt aber beim Seif und Parshas HaKarbonos da, nit gestanden vayem Moshe b'nei Yisrael. So now we come back to the point of why the Torah has to say that Moshe Rabbeinu said over all the halachas of the Karbonos to the Yidden. If that would not say here, it would not say that Moshe Rabbeinu said over all the halachas to Yidden. Was demolt yesh b'mashma as b'parshas nedarim hischul devarav. And then from the flow of the parsha would seem that Moshe Rabbeinu said to the Yidden only the halachas of nedarim. On lo yav alehem zu. He did not say to the Yidden all the halachas of the Karbonos. That's what it would seem from the flow of the Psukim. That would force me to say that yes, perhaps this pasuk is out of place. Sie ist gesagt geworden zu Moshe zusammen mit und noch vor Parshas Hamoedes von Parshas Emor. It was said together with Parshas Emor and actually even before Parshas Emor. Now the Torah is masmich the Parsha dot zu lieber gewissen Tam. There's a reason why the Torah puts it over here, but it's out of order. Ubemele is loy amalem elozu die prate dinim von unser Parsha. Moshe Rabbeinu did not say to the Yidden all the halachas, all the details of this week's Parsha. Zu alle Yidden hat gesagt, nar die dinim von Parshas Emor, Kanal Sivav. And then I would say that in fact Moshe Rabbeinu did not repeat to the Yidden all the halachas of the Karbonos in this week's Parsha, and the reason is because it's not relevant to all the Yidden. The Torah that's the reason why the Torah is dividing the two, even though they were said at the same time. Parshas Emor, it was said earlier because that's what Moshe Rabbeinu told the Yidden, and then for whatever reason the Torah puts right over here Parshas Pinchas, this week's Parsha, and this was not said over to the Yidden. And that's what it seems in the context of the Psukim. That only next week's Parsha, Moshe Rabbeinu spoke to the Yidden, but all the Karbonos in this week's Parsha were not said to the Yidden. Why? What's the reason? Because it's not relevant to the Yidden. It's the halachas of the Karbonos. That's what I would have said if it would not say this extra pasuk by Yomer Moshe, that Moshe Rabbeinu spoke to all the Yidden. I would take the second approach that this forces me to say, Ein mukdem u'mocha b'Torah. Und der Rebbe muss stehen, der Pasuk, Vayeme Moshe b'nei Yisrael beim Seif von unser Parsha. So therefore the Torah does write that Moshe Rabbeinu said it to the Yidden, zu klar machen, als Moshe hat übergegeben euch die Parsha zu alle Yidden. That Moshe Rabbeinu did give over all the halachas to the Yidden. Und davon ist verstandig, als die Parsha ist gesagt geworden da. And from this we understand that the Parsha was said over here, ukepashtus aksuvim, and like the simple Parsha seems that it's said in order, as pashtus aksuvim, as the Parsha is kumen ala seder, that everything is written in order, and Moshe Rabbeinu did repeat this to the Yidden, and everything is in the place where it's written in the Torah. So this is the explanation of why I would think to say that this is a Parsha that Moshe Rabbeinu did not repeat to the Yidden, because there's room to say that it's written out of order, and this is something that is not relevant for all the Yidden, so it wasn't given over to all the Yidden. And therefore the Torah has to clarify, no, Vayem Moshe, that even all these halachas of Karbonos was given over to all the Yidden. Now the Rebbe concludes the inyan over here with another detail where there's a difference between what it says in Parshas Emor and here in this week's Parsha. Noch hashinit zwischen Parshas Hamoedes von Emor und Parshas HaKarbonos to Parshas Emor. There's another difference. Dorten steht b'siyam Parsha Vayedaber Moshe. Und da Vayeme Moshe. Both places it says that Moshe Rabbeinu gave it over to Yidden, once Vayedaber, once Vayeme. V'yeshleima der bir bezeh al derech ha'alacha. So we could say that explanation as follows. In Parshas Emor, wo es redt sich be'iker wegen dinim, wo seine negeya and alles mannen beshovet. Speaking about those halachas of Yomim Tovim that are relevant for all times. Is malacha b'Yom Tov, the mitzvah von jeden Yom Tov. Those are the Isser of not doing work and all the other details of the halachas of every Yom Tov, matzah, lulav, and so on. Wird gesagt, b'loshen vayedaber. So it uses the term vayedaber, was weiß the fazach, was is nimshach, v'loi nifsak. The language vayedaber means that it's something that's forever and never is interrupted, as the Rebbe brings from the Rogatchover. Masha'enken, in unser Parsha, wo se redt sich be'ike, wegen Karbonos, was eine nitake pshute bis man Golos, it speaks about the Karbonos, that literally, Karbonos, physically, you do not have in the time of Golos. It says, you can only learn the halachas that are counted like bringing the karbanis, shteit lashon amira. So this is something that gets interrupted in the physical sense. So it says the lashon of amira that they spoke to the Yidden. V'oid, another difference between vayedaber and vayemer. The dinim from Ma'idim v'zenen da and alles manim b'shaveh. Those halachas of Emor that are in all times equally shteit by ze vayedaber versus haloshin kosher. Vayedaber is a stronger expression. The Eibishter mont betoikiv by Yidden, because the Eibishter is demanding strongly from all the Yidden as mizal mekayim zayin the mitzvahs to fulfill them. On unterschied si bizman beis hamikdash or the bizman hagolos, and there's no difference. There's nothing that should stop you, whether it's the time of the beis hamikdash, whether not. You should always fulfill these mitzvahs. But when it comes there to the karbanis, which cannot always be brought, and a yid has to just learn the halachas, so this is not a command, and it's not always an obligation. So therefore it's not demanded so strongly. On the contrary, Yidden are the ones that demand by the Eibishter that the Eibishter should quickly rebuild the Beis Hamikdash and v'sham nasel fanecha karbanes chaviseinu kemitzvah setzenecha k'moshe kesafta aleinu v'seiresecha gemeint parshaseinu, that we should fulfill what it says in this week's parsha, nit not oisik b'toyre keilu hikriv, and we should not only have to say it, and it's as if we're bringing the karbanis. Therefore it uses a softer language that Eibishter bet sich by Yidden as his own oisig zayin b'sei the karbanis. The Eibishter is begging the Yidden that they should learn the halachas of the karbanis, kailol befrat von unser parsha, including what it says in this week's parsha, zogen die psukim betfilas hayayim, where we say these psukim in the tefillah every day. Ubechlal zich oisig zayin b'teire seile, to learn the halachas of the karbanis. Was durch dem is ki'ilu hikriv. When you're oisig in these halachas, it's as if you're bringing these karbanis. Und das wird bringen dem hikriv eile v'chol kipshutai. This will hasten and bring about the opportunity to bring the karbanis literally. HaMelech HaMashiach Beina Mikdash. He will rebuild the Beis HaMikdash v'chayzrin makriven karbanis k'chol mitzvasa amura b'teire, to bring all these karbanis as it's written here in the Teire. V'mheira v'yameinu mamish or kanal, as mentioned before, that v'sham nasel fanecha as karbanis chaviseinu k'mitzvas ritzeinecha.